we have to talk about Vaticanus and the distigmai. Yeah. So now I go back to Dr. Philip Payne and some of the work that he's done since the late 90s involving the distigmai. So I think Nehemiah,
Call him
Dr.
Nehemiah if you have to, or
All
Nehemiah.
right, Dr. Nehemiah. That's it, Nehemiah.
Or
Dr.
Dr.
Nehemiah.
Gordon. If you call
Yeah,
him Dr. Gordon,
Dr.
that's
Gordon.
easy.
There we go.
Yeah.
There we go. We're running around with a crowbar. Some might get the reference. um, so Dr. Nehemiah Gordon, or Dr. Gordon, maybe I'll just call him Dr. Gordon because it's easier. It was right of him, I think, at the end of the article to explain Dr. Payne's contributions, right? Because
Yeah.
although the date of the distigma, I don't think is working out to his favor. The fact is that his discovery that the distigma reference textual variants um, is pretty big. Like that's a big discovery. So
Yeah.
we don't want to minimize that. So I think it was good of Dr. Gordon to point that out. Now, what gets really interesting though is when he starts applying this XFC, is it XRF or XFC? Um,
Uh,
some
X,
sort of special testing,
X,
micro
XRF.
X-ray fluorescence. Yeah. Um,
XRF. Yeah.
so when applied to both the chocolate colored distigmai and the apricot colored distigmai, they all come out as the same amount of copper. So there's like a really interesting chemistry thing going on there with the
Yeah.
purification of the type of ink and stuff. But yeah, do you want to explain that just a little bit?
Yeah, so the debate has always been since Philip Payne made this discovery. Now, Philip Payne's discovery is important. So what he discovered is that there is a text critical connection in between these double dots, these distigmai. Um, there is a connection between these dots and text critical matters, and that has stood the test of the discussion over the past 20 years. And the question is, are these double dots ancient? Or are they much more recent? And like you say, it's this use of XRF, X-ray fluorescence, kind of actually gives you a chemical fingerprint. They actually talk about that terminology of fingerprint. It gives you a chemical fingerprint of the ink that is used. And they tested not just the ink of these double dots, they actually tested the ink of the main text. They
Hmm.
tested the ink of some of the other annotations. There are actually dozens and dozens of
That's right.
annotations all over Codex Vaticanus. People who say the Codex Vaticanus wasn't used, they're just talking, they're just
Right, right.
blowing wind because
Well, I mean,
actually
someone came along and put chapter markers in the
there are
Old Testament
there are
in Roman
chapter
numeral
divisions,
script.
there are chapter divisions in Roman
Yeah,
numeral script, there are chapter divisions in
in
Arabic
Arabic. Yeah,
script, there are lectionary markings in part of the manuscript, in Acts and in the Old Testament. There's all
yeah.
kinds of things all over the place in Vatican. And they've tested a lot of these different annotations. And what's become very clear is that distigmai are they're written in a kind of ink which only the process for making that ink only became used in Europe at the
In this,
turn of the 15th and
that's
16th
right.
century.
That's right.
Basically, 1500 onwards, that's when that ink started being used. And it didn't matter what color the ink appeared. And this was their big point, was that a lot of this discussion has been about the colors of the ink, and some dots had been double dipped, they had been re-inked, they had been
Right.
done. Some of them had not, some of them more faded, some of them had done. Yeah, basically they tested over 100 of these dots. So it's not just one or two of them. They tested hundreds of these
Okay.
things. So a good percentage of the dots were tested, and basically they said every time it's the same ink,
Yeah.
whether or not it's faded, or whether it's dark, or whether it is look like it's been re-inked a second time. It's the same ink. It's the same ink every time, and it is a 16th century or later ink. Now they have established that. Well, they didn't really establish. Somebody else had already established that this ink must have been used before 1590 or thereabouts, because
Right.
certain other things are overwritten. There are sometimes these double dots get overwritten by other
Right.
things. And those things, they've even identified some of the people, the particular persons who scribed those things. They can say very clearly this person interacted with Codex Vaticanus in 1580 or 1590, and he
Right.
overwrote. wrote a couple of the double dots. So that means these double dots are definitely written sometime between 1500 and 1580 or 1590. It's definitely in that less than a century period. That's when those double dots were put there.
Yeah, and what was exceptionally exceptionally interesting was the added pages for the Book of Hebrews, right? Because they were clearly damaged, and a scribe came. I think it was 10th or 12th century. I can never remember.
Well, no, actually, 15th century, but it was
Oh,
only
15th
only
century.
done about 100 years before Codex Vaticanus became really well.
I didn't. Yeah. So that page gets added later, and so
Yeah,
they tested the distigmai markings on the later added page. So we know that those distigmai were from a later time. Now, I mean, the argument was put forward that well, they're just copying the distigmai from wherever they did, but then when they took those distigmai and tested them, they came out with the exact same ink that was on the distigmai on the non-added pages.
yeah. So using this XRF technology, they're able to distinguish at least 4 or 5 different types of inks
Hmm.
very clearly. So the ink, though, the original writing and the rewriting of Codex Vaticanus, they've seen the inks that are used to make those Roman numerals you were talking about, and the
Hmm.
Arabic numerals. The ink of the supplementary pages that are found in the supplementary pages are found at the start as well. Most of Genesis is supplementary pages, just like most of Hebrews are supplementary pages, and they were able to test the various different writing at different points along the way. And yeah, what's clear is that the distigmai, whatever part of the Vaticanus you look at, whether it's in the whether they're dark or whether they're light, whether they're apricot, none of this
Hmm.
apricot colored or chocolate colored. At least we can agree on chocolate. Uh,
You
um,
say things funny.
Canadians, Canucks.
Nice.
Anyway, the fact is, it's the same ink, and it's a 16th century ink that's
Hmm.
used throughout. Now, you can't use this method to give an absolute dating for all of the inks.
Right.
You can distinguish the inks of the different writers and the different scribes
Yes.
within Vaticanus. And in fact, this is a story that has not yet finished. There is more work coming from these guys.
I saw
But
a couple things in that article. Yeah.
we have not heard the last from Ira Rabin and probably Nehemiah Gordon and Proud. And there is more to come. And some of that could be interesting to see
Hmm.
where that goes. But yeah, but I think the idea that the distigmai are from any other period than the 16th century, that's case closed. I think there was quite a lot of good evidence that they were from the 16th century even
Right,
before that.
right.
There were different ways in which people had looked at the question. Philip Payne wasn't convinced, and a couple of other people were not convinced as well. But I think the case is pretty much closed now
Yeah.
by the use of XRF.
Yeah, I think it's gonna be very, very difficult now to claim that those distigmai are anything other than 15th century, 16th century marking.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think you're right. I think that's done. I think the work there has been completed to a very high degree of certainty. So I don't think.
But there is a little bit more work to be done with them, and that is to try to maybe nail down, do we really know who put them in there?
Right.
Because there are some, strong contenders.
Hmm.
Sepulveda, or however
Yep.
you pronounce his name, I
Sepulveda.
have
Yeah.
no idea. Sepulveda or whatever.
Yeah.
On the anyway, I think there's a very strong case that he is the most likely
Hmm.
candidate. And then the question then becomes Andrew Brown's question: why did he only give 365 of these references to Erasmus in 1532 or 1534, whenever it was, something like that, when there are over 700, maybe
Hmm.
even 800 distigmai in the New
Right.
Testament. So that's that question. And I know there's people working on that. I've got my own kind of
Yeah. Yeah.
instinctive theory as to what's going on. But I
Yeah.
think that
I'd love to hear that. But
Okay,
I do want to mention real quick that our mutual friend James Snap Jr. had an honorable mention in that article.
he
Yeah,
did
and
get it.
his yeah he had
He
his
did
theory
indeed.
that a copyist misquoted
Yeah,
365 and should have put 765 based on the
that's
Roman
right.
numeral
Yeah,
D
yeah,
versus C or where
yeah.
yeah.
Um,
So yeah,
I,
what's your theory?
Okay, my theory is that Sepulveda was cherry picking. I have a very specific theory of what he was doing. He had picked up a copy of Erasmus's fourth edition of his New Testament. Now, Erasmus's fourth edition is really interesting because not only does it have the Greek and the Latin, it actually has two versions of the Latin. It has a fairly traditional Vulgate text and Erasmus's own Latin text. And I think what Sepulveda was doing was he was reading the Latin columns because that was really easy for him to do, easier than the Greek column, and
Hmm.
he was noticing places where they were different. And then he'd cast his eye over at the Greek and to see if he knew his Greek as well, to see if the Greek kind of backed it up. And he was doing this with Vaticanus open in front of him, and he
Okay.
basically marked Vaticanus as he was going through, reading through the fourth edition of Erasmus. He was working his way through Vaticanus and just putting in the dots as he worked through it. Now, like anybody doing a process like this, he doesn't have Excel. He can't just,
Right.
do the kind of things you do with the data and stuff. He just has to put in all these sort of markings, and then he has to go through it a second time and look at them again and say, well, which ones are really worth pointing out to Erasmus? And Sepulveda's agenda is to prove that the Vulgate is a good translation and it's a better
Right.
translation than Erasmus's. So he's going to
Okay.
pick every place in Vaticanus that backs the Vulgate.
Right.
Um, and so I think that a very careful study, and I suspect there are people already doing this, but I'm fairly sure I know somebody is. Uh,
Hmm.
a fairly careful study of the distigma and comparing the Erasmus's editions will probably reveal that if it was Sepulveda, he's probably cherry picking data. He's
Right.
cherry picking the examples that make his case, that
Right.
support what he wants to say.
Okay. See, my theory would have been that as he was going through and copying all these down to send off to Erasmus, his coffee ran out at 365 and he said, "Well, forget it. I'm not doing the rest of the 400." So
Yeah. Well, we do know that that Erasmus did get hold of now we don't know, we don't have the list of 365. We know that that was the number, but we don't know what they were.
right.
Except there are four places in Erasmus's New Testament later editions where he seems to have picked up on the Vaticanus readings.
Okay.
Now, some of them may have come from Bombast, who Erasmus had consulted earlier. Some of them may come from Sepulveda's list as well. So it
Right.
looks like Sepulveda's list does cover the entire.
Yeah, James found a place in Acts with a unique reading in Vaticanus and was able to link that back to Sepulveda and I think his annotations.
Yeah, well, there's
Yeah.
there's there's another I think there's another example where there's a unique Vaticanus connection, and that's to do with one of them is to do with uh the names of the island of Crete in
Oh,
Acts.
okay.
So
Okay.
and what's the spelling of that island, and that one's actually been discussed a little bit
Hmm.
in the previous literature. Yeah. Yeah. So I think on the distigma, I think the distigma date question I think is closed. I
Hmm.
think what someone was doing in the 16th century with those distigma, that question is still open and is actually an interesting question to discuss. And so like we're doing right now. And I also think the other thing with this whole business with this XRF X-ray fluorescence study
Hmm.
of Vatican. What this does is it's going to open up some other questions about the history of Vaticanus, and
Hmm.
we're gonna have to wait I don't know how long, another
Yeah.
6 months, year, another 2 years to hear from the same crew. I think we're going to hear from
Yeah.
them again, which will be interesting. And I think the other thing it opens up, I know there are some people out there, and I'm not going to name names, who
Okay.
just
Okay.
constantly going on about Sinaiticus. Now it's never been tested and all that. And is it a 19th century fake and all that kind of
Right.
thing?
Right.
I think the fact that the Vatican have allowed, in fact, not just allowed, it seems like they encouraged this testing to be done, will only add a little bit of motivation to the holders of the
Right.
various Sinaiticus to subject Sinaiticus to similar kinds of testing.
Now
Now,
I
personally,
gotta mention this now though, right? Now, if we're gonna talk about doing the same thing to Sinaiticus,
mhm,
there's a little bit of risk involved now, right?
of course,
Given what we've talked about earlier and the theft of manuscripts and the
yeah,
kind of skullduggery surrounding that, they
yeah.
could uncover something there that is not favorable to their ownership, right? So there's I'd be a little hesitant, right?
Ab-
I want to
ab-
keep my stolen
Absolutely.
manuscript.
Well, you know, yeah, truth matters, and the truth will out
Absolutely.
in the
100%.
end. And so I think the testing of the various inks and so forth of Vaticanus and the various different inks of Sinaiticus is a totally legitimate thing to be doing. And if we're serious about the truth, it should be something that should be done. Now, I actually personally have very few hesitations about subjecting either of those manuscripts to testing. I
That's
think
right.
there may be some surprises. I'll say, that we might be surprised by what some of the things that will come out from
Mhm.
very thorough thing, but I don't think that some of the more interesting theories about the origins of Sinaiticus are like to stand up to scrutiny.
Right.
Uh, yeah, I don't think it's going to work. Yeah, but
All
anyway, that's an opinion.
All right. Well, it is what close to midnight there where you are, and it is close to 11 in the morning where I'm at. So I think this is probably a good place to call it. Thank you
Yeah.
so much, Heaven, for your expertise. It's always great talking with you. I enjoy
Well,
interacting online and
at least reading around the subject and trying to absorb as much as I can, and
that's right.
being willing to spout my opinions from time to time.
That's right. Well, it's been good having you. Anyway, brothers and sisters, I hope you found this encouraging and interesting. And until next time, we'll see you around.